Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Danny Brown Talks Phoenix. I am your host, Danny Brown, and this is our monthly market update that we do. As always, I'm joined by Garret Cerkvenik of JFQ Lending. Pleasure to have you here, Garret.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot over the last couple of weeks about how this market update was going to be a little bit different than our normal market updates because so much has been happening in the economy and in the world that is just lots of people have lots of questions.
Yes.
And so I thought that we would spend some time before we dig into like the housing notes and kind of what interest rates are doing and that kind of thing is really kind of breaking down what some of these big items are for people so that they can have a greater understanding of how these world events and things taking place in the economy will affect them and their day to day. So I kind of wanted to start with, the Fed. There's been a lot of talk about the Fed cut rates for the first time in 11 years last month. Everyone's predicting and assuming that the Fed is going to cut rates again next week. And there's even talks of them cutting an additional point next or before the end of the year. And there's some talks, primarily from Trump and his tweets, that he wants us to get to zero rates and possibly even negative interest rates. And so I really kind of wanted to simplify that and, explain to people what that means to them in their daily lives and how that could impact them and how, getting to 0% rates or even negative rates might not be the best thing for the economy or the best thing for our individual pocketbook. So the reason that the Fed has been cutting rates or cut rates last month and is probably going to cut rates again this next week is that everybody knows the world economy is really slowing down.
Yes.
And so we're starting to see slowdowns. Our GDP over quarter one was at 3.1%. The GDP this last quarter was down to 2.1%. So, that's a percentage drop. We're not anywhere near a recession, but the Fed is taking some aggressive stances to try and curtail any drop in the economy. And so the theory behind dropping rates is that banks will lend money to individuals at a cheaper rate, right?
Yes.
And that puts more money in hopefully mine and your pocket so that we
stimulate the economy
and spend money on things,
yes.
Whether that's buying cars, buying, products, homes, those types of things, and putting that money back into the economy. And a lot of this is kind of stemming from the trade war with China that is really having a negative impact on the economy. And I also think that the 2020 presidential election has a big part of it. It's really hard to oust an incumbent president, but it is I wouldn't say easy, but it's much easier to replace a president when you're in a recession and people are pissed off that they're unemployed and not making any money.
It's the biggest thing that people, think about because it's what has the biggest direct impact on their daily lives, So, and for those that don't know, the federal funds rate, what you're talking about here is the rate at which banks lend money to other banks or depository institutions lend money. So, when we saw the recession back in 2007 or the start of it, the federal funds rate was at a little over 5%, and then it dropped down to almost zero, and it held there for a number of years until the economy started to build back. And now we're at somewhere in the mid twos, and then they're talking about dropping it again, and then again by the end of the year. And so
some argue that they were trying to normalize and they tried to raise rates too fast.
Yes, 2018 we saw increases almost every quarter, whereas before that it was maybe an increase once a year, so it built slowly, and then 2018 it shot up, and we really saw, for consumers, in our industry, we saw mortgage rates really start to climb, and people start to see rates in the 5s and even 6s for the first time since before the Great Recession.
And from a corporate standpoint and for an individual standpoint, we all got very spoiled with those low rates, because when the Fed does lower rates or raise rates, where it does impact our bottom lines are on things like credit cards. if you have ARMs on as your mortgage, adjustable rate mortgages, home equity lines of credit. So a lot of people do home equity lines of credits if they are remodeling their home. So that's pulling equity out of your house for some sort of purchase. Some other things that are directly impacted are the interest rates on savings accounts and CDs. So when the Fed lowers rates, your fixed interest rates end up getting lowered as well on those investment type of accounts. So for a long time, we've seen super low returns on things like savings accounts and CDs. If the Fed does get to a point where they're not going to rapidly reduce rates, just like I think they learned not to rapidly increase rates. So if they do get to 0%, which Trump is pushing for, or even negative rates, they're speculating that would take place throughout 2020 and even into 2021. So if rates went to zero, Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of Chase, got together with the other CEOs of a lot of the big companies, and they just recently had a meeting. And when these guys get together, they're getting together because there's serious consideration of if we get to there. So while you were talking earlier that Trump's kind of an idiot when it comes to this kind of stuff, which I agree, but these guys are taking it serious.
Yeah.
And so
they have to. I mean, they're this is the president talking. And even though, I mean, it's crazy to think that they would take that rate down to zero because it didn't even go completely to zero in the recession, and now we have, the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We've got, all these things that currently are showing that our economy is doing very, very well. Why would we talk about taking rates backwards,
Yeah. But they're taking it serious. Yeah. And what that would mean if, it sounds great. Like, oh my gosh, interest rates are at zero. That's awesome. Free money. Or if it's negative, they're going to be paying me money. These banks are in business to make money. And so what the Fed ends up doing is if they're parking their money with, the Federal Reserve, the government's basically going to charge the banks interest to park their money there.
Yeah.
Is what that means if we're at negative rates. And so to make up for that, all these CEOs have gotten together and talk about how they are going to increase things like overdraft fees, ATM fees, fees on your checking account, fees on savings accounts. So if the rates on savings accounts go down and the fees go up and you start making negative money every month on what are you going to do with it? You're probably going to pull it out.
Pull your money out.
So
now,
in your mattress. Economists are speculating that if we go into negative rates, you could see a run on banks and people pulling money out of and just sitting on cash because they're not going to want to pay the fees. So there's a lot of danger if we get to that point. And I don't think that you would ever get a mortgage or any, credit card, like you're probably not going to have a fixed rate of 0%.
Exactly. I mean, the fact that right now you can get rates in the 3s or even 2s in some cases is bonkers, because historically when I started in this industry back in 2006, you had to have perfect credit and you had to pay a ton in closing costs to get to a 6% interest rate. And that was fine because people were coming off of, the 90s when rates were, even higher. And then the 80s when rates were at 18 and 20%, So the fact that we have rates in the 3s and the 2s right now, or even in the 4s is historically extremely low. I don't think it's going to go much lower, even if the federal funds rate goes down to zero or keeps getting cut. It's not necessary,
The good thing that's in place, I think, is that Jerome Powell wants normalization. He's the current Fed chair. And so I think, if Trump pisses and moans and does all these things, Jerome Powell will say no. But we have seen that, Trump will fire anyone that doesn't do what he wants to do.
Yeah.
So it's just going to be really interesting to watch and see what happens over the next, end of this year into 2020 to see how this is all going to kind of play out and develop. And so we're going to continue to pay attention to it and try and keep you guys up to date as much as we can. And I hope that we gave some clarity around what the federal fund rate means and kind of what it means to your pocketbook.
Yes.
I want to kind of shift gears then, unless you had anything else you want to touch. So I wanted to kind of shift gears then and talk about, there's been a ton in the news about the yield curve inverting and what does that mean and why should we ultimately care about it? And so just to give you kind of an overall definition, the yield curve should be shaped kind of like a bowl. In a normal market, the amount of interest that the government will pay investors for a short-term, basically a short-term loan or a short-term investment, needs to be lower than what it is on a long-term investment. So imagine buying a CD at a bank. They're going to give you a much lower interest rate on a monthly CD than they will on a CD for 5 years.
Yes.
So, you're tying your money up for a much longer period of time. And so what has ended up happening just last month and, a couple months prior to that is we've seen the interest rate on short-term bonds go higher than long-term bonds.
And what typically they're talking about there is the 10-year and the 2-year.
And the 2-year.
So,
that's correct.
And that essentially inverted. So now you're getting a better yield on the 2-year than you are on the 10-year. And that typically, historically, not always, it's just one of the indicators they look at, marks some sort of looming recession.
And that has to do with investor confidence.
Yes.
So the reason that it matters is because your institutional investors, your long-term investors are pulling money out of the stock market. So you typically see the stocks drop and they're investing in long-term bonds because they're not sold on the U.S. economy continuing to improve. They would rather tie their money up for a longer period of time, so investing in 10-year bonds, than lose money in the stock market. So the rates are all based on supply and demand. So if you see a flood of investors purchasing these long-term bonds, the supply goes down, and so does the rate. So that's kind of what we're seeing. It's kind of flat. So the inversion wasn't this drastic change. It was very close. We've since corrected a little bit. But that's why it's important, because it is a very good indicator that we could be potentially facing a recession. It's not something that, oh gosh, the yield curve inverted, we're in a recession now.
It could be anywhere from 9 to 36 months out is typically what happens. And, recession, what marks a recession historically is what? 2 quarters of a reduction in gross domestic product. So that's typically what they look for. And a lot of times, again, you're looking backwards. The recession in 2001, we didn't know we were even in a recession until the end of the year or the end of it. And then you look back and said, oh, well, and, a recession doesn't always mean what everybody thinks it means when we saw what happened in 2007 and 8 and 9. You know? I mean, that's, especially a lot of the millennials that, grew up in that time period and are now working adults, that's the only recession they can remember. And so when they start hearing that word, it's, oh my gosh, home values are going to go down.
Right.
We're all going to lose our jobs. It's this doom and gloom, which isn't always the case. Especially, I think, in this one, or what they're expecting coming up.
I completely agree with you. So, this is a good way to kind of transition from talking about the yield curve and why it matters, and it's that indicator of potential recession. So, like you had mentioned, what is a recession? That's 2 consecutive quarters where the gross domestic product, and that's basically how much the United States is making on all their products and services that they're selling, is negative. And like I mentioned before, last quarter we were at 3.1% GDP. This quarter we just finished, we're at 2.1% GDP. So we're not negative yet. And the recession that we all faced, all of our friends, most of our generation, that's really the first recession that any of us cared about. The recession that was before that was in 2001. We were in our first year of college, maybe.
Yeah, I just graduated high school.
Yeah, a bunch of our friends were still in high school.
Delivering pizzas. Yeah. Not super worried about the recession.
Right? And that was kind of just a run-of-the-mill recession. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was very specific to a certain sector. It was due to the dot-com bubble that burst, and it affected tech primarily. You didn't really see any sort of impact on housing whatsoever. The Great Recession was very specific to people playing fast and loose with money and lending and being super irresponsible in who they were giving money to.
Yes.
And it was very specific to the housing sector.
And also people taking money. It wasn't, a lot of people, look back and say, oh, well, it was the banks that were just giving us all these bad loans. And but you had consumers out there also taking on bad loans and not reading what they were signing. And I remember, because I started, before the recession in the mortgage industry, and, you had stated loans, for instance, where it doesn't require you to prove your income, your assets, anything like that. And you didn't have to have great credit to get one. I think back then it was a 620 credit score, which is poor credit.
Yeah.
And you have people
that stated income loans.
Exactly.
So if you did have good credit and you just said, I make $200,000 a year, they're just like, okay,
here you go. And you had people that were buying, that make 30, 40, 50 grand a year, that were buying 3, 4, 5 houses, and, because home values were going up at such a fast pace, they weren't worried about what happened in the future, what kind of loan they got, and whether or not they could afford it, because they were renting these houses out, making a return, selling them in some cases, and making a huge return in just a short period of time. And so but you did have a lot of bad loans out there. A lot of banks giving people loans that, were on short-term adjustables, that could adjust way up after the first year. And, so it was kind of on both ends, the lending institutions, but also consumers taking on these debts that they knew they couldn't afford.
Yeah.
And that's what created the crisis.
Yeah, and that's why it heavily impacted the housing market.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a recession, which we undoubtedly will, every bull market is followed by a recession. So right now we're in the 11th year of a bull market, which is the longest in U.S. recorded history, but it's not the longest in recorded history. Australia had a bull market for over 25 years.
Wow.
So it's not unheard of for bull markets to be this long. And so a lot of people are talking about the chances of a recession, of us going into a recession, are not going to be due to consumers. It's going to be more due to poor policy from the U.S. government, federal policy, monetary policy, and those types of things. So some are speculating, again, the yield curve inverting is due to that. It's a false positive almost, because it was a inversion that happened due to poor policy, not poor economy. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but
we'll know at some point.
Yeah, right. So the reason this recession will be different is it will be in a completely different sector, not related to the housing market. And so,
and in fact, most are not housing related. I saw a graph the other day where out of the last 5 recessions, we had the last one, which was the big one. You had 2001, where home values, I think, went up 6.6%. The previous one before that, they went down, or they stayed pretty level, went down maybe 1 to 2%.
Isn't it 6 out of the last 9 recessions, property values either stayed flat or went up?
Yep, exactly.
So, and that includes the Great Recession.
Yep.
So, and the 2 others, property values didn't tumble.
Again, it was 1 to 2%. They went down a small amount. So if you own a $200,000 house, you saw a $4,000 drop in your property value. That's not enormous.
Yeah.
It's just a regular market that fluctuates.
And I actually think that a recession could be healthy for the Phoenix real estate market. And the reason that I think that is because right now in Phoenix, I did a search yesterday to see how many active properties were available in the greater metro Phoenix area. So that includes, most of Maricopa County and then parts of Pinal County. So that's grabbing, town of Maricopa, Santan Valley, the places where generally, if you're moving to Phoenix, you're looking in this kind of sphere. And it was 11,000 homes. That's single family homes, condos, and townhomes.
And that's probably 1.5 months of supply.
Of
nothing
inventory.
else went on the market.
Yeah, if nothing else went on the market, we would sell out of homes in 1.5 months. And that's bonkers. So while that sounds great for sellers and, means that property values are going to skyrocket, that's not necessarily healthy for the housing market overall.
And you would think the opposite. You would think that if there's less inventory, property values will increase faster because supply and demand. That's just what the thought is. But
and I think that it will. Be different? Well, so pricing is usually a lagging indicator in the housing market anyway. So the last thing to react to supply and demand in the Phoenix real estate market is prices. So we have not seen a drastic skyrocket of home values. I think that we will. Coming October, if everything holds true to what has happened over the last 11 years, the Phoenix real estate market is super predictable. the end of fall, late September, October, early November is super busy. Lots of sales take place. Things really slow down in December, and then spring is crazy, crazy busy. So if everything holds constant, we might see price values increase a little bit through October and November. And come spring, if we don't have additional inventory, I think home values are going to increase very rapidly. And so, with low interest rates, you're going to have a lot of buyers trying to buy, and they're all going to be fighting over the same lack of inventory. And so if we do have a recession, that could signal some relief for the housing market. Typically with recessions, you want to pay attention to, again, the yield curve inverting is usually the first signal. Volatility in the stock market is not as good of an indicator as one might think, because the stock market kind of bounces around anyway. And another one is wage growth and the jobs report. And so we're at historic lows for unemployment. I think we're at 3.6, 3.7% unemployment. They say wage growth is going up. I don't know exactly what sectors they measure when they measure wage growth. Are they taking into account everyone, including the top 1%? And so I don't necessarily, in my own personal believe that wage growth is growing as quickly as what the jobs report would indicate. Okay. Because I do think that there's a lot of individuals out there that are working, 2 jobs, part of the gig economy, driving for Uber, plus working their normal 9 to 5 to make ends meet. So I don't necessarily think that wage growth is going up as rapidly as the jobs report would indicate. So
we touched on that a couple of months ago. So,
and those tend to be the indicators that you want to look for a recession. And so the only real indicator that we've seen that there's some sort of economic trouble is the yield curve inverting. But to my point, that if there is a recession and it's in some sort of other sector, I'm speculating manufacturing and farming, that could be healthy for at least the Phoenix real estate market, because we have so few homes for sale. So if people are forced to sell their home because they can't necessarily afford to live in it anymore, or there are a minor uptick in some foreclosures, that could add relief to the housing market, where we have so few properties for sale that adding a few thousand extra homes to our inventory is going to be a good thing for buyers. They'll have choices. Yeah. But I also argue that it's going to be a good thing for sellers too. You don't want rapid increases in home values. You don't want that hockey stick effect, because that's not sustainable over the long run. And I can't tell you how many clients that we have that want to sell a home right now, the current one they're in, and buy another house, but they're not, because they can't find anything that they would move for.
I just ran into that myself, when we bought a couple of months ago. I mean, it was tough, and we were fully prepared to just move into a 1-bedroom apartment while we were looking, because we really weren't finding a lot on the market that we that fit what we were looking for, and so that is an issue. And we had already put our house on the market, and decided that we were going to do that because we thought it was a good time to sell, and so we were okay making that choice. But I can definitely see a lot of homeowners that will refrain from doing that and just stay where they're at, because they're on Zillow and they're on, maybe not even working with an agent yet, but they're just not finding anything that's really pushing them to take that first step.
Yeah, it's stalling the housing market. And whenever, the pendulum for these things, for any market, swings back and forth. And in 2007 through like 2010, it was very far in the buyer side of things. And right now it's pretty far in the seller side. And I don't think that that's ever healthy for a real estate market or any market. And Econ 101 is markets are constantly seeking balance. So there has to be some sort of correction or relief from somewhere. So again, I argue that having, a run-of-the-mill recession, that's what I think this one would be, could be a good thing for the housing market in terms of if it adds some additional inventory to the real estate market.
Good. That's good to hear.
Yeah. So, we've had 11 recessions since World War II, and we've survived all of them. And a lot what comes out of recessions a lot of times are, lots of millionaires are made during recessions. So, I know several people that during the housing crisis invested lots of money in real estate when the sky was falling, because they kept their cool. And when you have a recession, I think that's one of the most important things that you can do is not to panic.
Well, because what typically can have the biggest impact on a recession is consumer confidence and what people think about what's going on, and if everybody just held their stuff together, it's not as big of an impact as you would think.
Well, and it's interesting you say that. So what's really propping up the economy right now is consumer confidence. So consumer spending makes up over 2/3 of our economy. So as long as the American people are buying stuff and investing in our economy and spending like they normally would, that's going to continue to, the economy will continue to clip along. And so what I'm fearful of is we've never had more access to news, these 24-hour news cycles, social media, podcasts, everybody talking about these things, and that can really shake consumer confidence. And so if everybody's talking about, recession's coming, you better tighten up, that could, affect consumer confidence, and people will stop buying stuff.
Yeah.
And that could then push us
Deeper.
into that,
Yeah.
Recession faster
Yeah.
than it might otherwise take place. And so I think this, could be a good opportunity for us to transition into what I think the biggest factor in all of this is the trade war with China. So the trade war with China has been front and center in the news quite a bit,
and it's impacted everything.
It
from
is.
mortgage rates to it's I mean, and
it's impacting the entire world. And
it's the two biggest economies in the world,
Correct.
Going at each other. So
well, what's interesting is it's also having unintended consequences. The fire that's raging in the Amazon is a direct result of the trade war with China. We're the largest producer of soybeans, and China's the biggest importer of soybeans. China's taxing soybeans and not importing as much into their country now, and looking for other ways in other countries to get soybeans from. And so Brazil, their leadership, their president, encouraged farmers to clear cut the rainforest, plant soybeans so that they could sell them to China. And they listened, and the fires got out of control. So there's consequences way beyond just taxing goods that I don't think anybody saw coming, and it's not necessarily anyone's fault, but those are indirect consequences of this trade war. And I think it's important for people to understand what a tariff even is, because when they were talking about it, I was like, oh, cool, I don't really care.
Yeah.
But we really should, because
it impacts us directly. I mean, a tariff is going to be a tax on.
It's a tax on the American people.
And exactly. And who's going to pay for it? We are,
Correct.
I mean, it's what things are costing us to bring into our country and to buy on the consumer side. Nobody else is paying for it but us. And that's, I think a lot of people don't realize that. And then all the, what the president is saying, is kind of steering people away from understanding that that's actually what's happening.
Yeah. And so in a normal cycle, the American people pay anywhere from 30 to 40 billion extra in taxes, basically due to tariffs. Right now, because of the trade war with China, through June, we're at $63 billion.
Wow.
And this is directly what the American consumer and American businesses are paying for. And the question I have is, where's all that money going? And through some of the research I did, most of it is going to prop up the farming industry that's been hit the hardest due to these tariffs. And in fact, the U.S. government is spending 130% of the money that they're collecting from tariffs, so more than what they're collecting from tariffs, to prop up U.S. farmers because of how negatively it's been impacting them. And surprise, surprise, I mean, Trump's base is middle America, lots of farmers. So, he's propping them up. And so not only are we paying extra and businesses paying extra for these tariffs, but we're also running up our debt in addition to that, because we're trying to prop up these industries that have been negatively impacted. And the tariffs haven't really hit us yet in terms of you and I, major cities. The items that they're speculating that will be the greatest impacted in terms of pricing. So if the tariffs continue the way that they're going, what will be impacted the most are going to be things like AC units, appliances, cars and parts, batteries, bikes, clothes, the makeup you buy, almost all consumer electronics, food, furniture, mattresses, luggage, home improvement items, sporting goods, and the list goes on and on. These are all items that we use every single day.
Yeah.
They're going to get more and more expensive, and they're speculating that additional cost of goods is going to cost your average family of four an additional $2,300 per year, and that could potentially cost the U.S. economy over 1 million jobs lost.
Wow.
So all of this comes out, the tariffs could be the thing that pushes us into a recession and could really curtail consumer confidence and consumer spending. If goods become way more expensive and that TV you were looking at is all of a sudden several $100s more expensive and you decide not to buy it now, imagine you and everybody else in the country doing that same thing. That has a hugely negative impact on our economy as a whole. So less people buying goods means less goods being produced, which in turn means less jobs. So it's kind of this snowball effect where each of these individual things that we're talking about are not that individual. They're all connected and interrelated to a greater problem that we're facing. And so while I don't agree with the tariffs that Trump has put in place, I do agree that China has needed to be dealt with for a very long time. They've been stealing intellectual property. They've been stealing our IPs, our data. They have not been a very good trade partner for the United States. Where I think the issue and the problems lie is that, Trump likes to go at these things alone. And instead of getting our allies, which for the most part is like the whole world, all of Europe, Canada, Mexico, to go at it together and face China, he's trying to do this by himself. And where I have fear is that the United States looks at things in 4 and 8 year timelines, right? Because that's when elections happen.
Yeah.
And that's how long our leaders are in office. China, on the other hand, looks at things in 40 and 50 year timelines. And where they can outlast us, I think, in a trade war, because they don't care about their people the way the U.S. cares about our people. Again, the U.S. economy is propping up farmers. Does the leadership in China really care if, people in China aren't able to make as much money? I think that they would probably just up and move an entire city if it benefited the country. So I think America thinks very short term, where China is going to be thinking very long term, and I think they can outlast us and beat us in any sort of trade war. So I really hope that we can get it figured out and come to some sort of trade solution.
Well, and if we can't right now, everybody go vote and let's figure it out in 2020 then.
Yeah. I mean, so the good news is that all of the tariff talk has been delayed, correct? So Trump has thankfully delayed any sort of additional tariffs on Chinese goods until after the holidays, which is just so sweet of him to do. So, if these things take place, I don't think we're going to fall into a recession unless consumer confidence really falls. And if consumer confidence stays where it's at, we should be okay. We should be able to limp along. The economy should be all right. And if the cost of goods becomes way more expensive, that could be the thing that pushes us over the edge and pushes us into that recession, which again, I want to reiterate that even if we do go into a recession, I don't think it's going to be housing, and I don't think it's going to be terrible. I think it's going to be one of your kind of run-of-the-mill recessions. Recessions still aren't fun. I came up with some suggestions on some things that you can do to prepare yourself, the average person, you and I, to prepare yourself for a recession if you think one's coming and you're fearful of it. So one of the first things that they suggest that you do is, if a recession is looming, is to pay down bad debt. And to me, and chime in here if you want, but bad debt are things like credit cards, variable lines of credit, all those things that are going to become cheaper as the Fed reduces rates.
Yeah, I mean, your good debt, your best piece of debt that you have is your mortgage.
Correct.
I mean, it's a low interest rate. It's typically going to be fixed. It's tax deductible if you itemize. It's simple interest. You're not paying compounded amounts like a credit card. Credit cards, I think, are going to be your worst piece of debt because the interest rates are extremely high.
Yep.
That most people have. I mean, there's other stuff out there like payday loans and things like that. But credit cards for most people,
it's all bad, like really bad.
It's all
payday loans,
exactly.
Pay that stuff off.
Pay it all off. So focus on your credit cards. After your credit cards are there or are gone, I mean, even auto loans typically are pretty decent pieces of debt. I mean, for most people, you're paying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% interest. There are some bad auto loans out there that you'd want to get rid of, but same thing. It's simple interest. You're paying a set amount of interest that's fixed, and you can typically make more money on that money elsewhere. So keep your home, pay that off last. Auto loan, before that. Anything else, always take care of before those two.
Yep. So first thing you want to do then, like we said, pay down bad debts. Then the other thing you want to do, which Americans are terrible at, is have an emergency fund. Mm-hmm. So once you've paid off your bad debt, you're used to making those payments. Continue to make those payments, but put that money in a savings account, a coffee can, whatever, and you should have 3 to 6 months worth of expenses saved in case something happens. If you lose your job, if your car breaks, whatever, you need to have 3 to 6 months. And these are essential expenses. So if you've got, a house cleaner and a landscape, I'm not talking about those things because those are items that you can kind of cut if you get into financial trouble. But I'm talking about your mortgage, your car payment, grocery bills, your utilities, those types of things. Sit down and map out what that looks like and start saving to have that cash available, and keep it in cash, whether it's in just a traditional bank savings account or like I said, a coffee can, whatever, bury it in the backyard, but have 3 to 6 months worth of savings set aside as an emergency fund. And then if you can, it's great to try to create, this is a good opportunity to create additional streams of revenue. I know that sounds more complicated than it actually is. You can create additional streams of revenue by a variety of different things. I see Gary Vaynerchuk all the time driving around to garage sales and flipping personal items. He looks for goods and looks up on eBay what those things are selling for, buys them super cheap at groceries, and he'll make, just to prove that it can be done, he'll go out and he'll make, $200, $300, $400 extra dollars in a weekend by flipping stuff that he finds at garage sales.
Interesting.
So there's a plethora of ways to try and make some additional income if you're worried about what the future looks like in terms of going into recession. Then I also think it's important take advantage of the fact that we're not in a recession and update your resume. Have that updated right now and start networking and putting yourself out there, meeting new people, because if a recession does hit and it affects your sector specifically, you've already kind of started that process. You've laid the groundwork to get out ahead of it. So I think it's important to have that done as well. The other thing is live within your means. We're a instant gratification society. We want what we want and we want it now, and we're willing to rack up credit card debt in order to get it. And I think it's important to, maybe forego that dinner out or, forego that television or whatever. If you can't afford to buy it in cash or put it on credit and pay it off right away, then you probably shouldn't buy it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's also important at this time, depending on your age, to talk to your financial advisor and explore what your risk tolerance are. If you're super young and a recession hits, that's awesome for you. And if the stock market tanks and you're young, you got to love that because everything's on sale and you can buy more. If you're closer to retirement or older, then you may not like the recession as much. So it might be a good idea to just strategize with your financial advisor and come up with a plan and make sure that your asset allocations are, properly distributed and that you're not, overly exposed if you don't have a long time horizon to make it up. And then I think it's important to also continue your education. Become super valuable at the company that you're working for. So continuing education, learning new skills, and really bolstering up your abilities, I think will make you more valuable. And so, kind of getting in front of it, I think is important. And then when you create that overall plan, stick to it and don't panic. I think that's probably the most important thing. And what led to the Great Recession was a lot of people panicked.
Yeah.
And, wealthy people, your Warren Buffetts of the world, when everybody's buying, he's selling. When everybody's selling, he's buying. So try not to be a sheep, stick to your plan. You'll get through it. Recessions are typically short. The average recession, I think, is 11 months. And the shortest one we've ever had was 6. And so they don't last very long. So, we're tough. We're Americans. We can weather a lot of shit. And so recessions aren't typically as bad as the one we just got out of. And even the one we just got out of really wasn't that bad. I mean, looking back on it,
we all survived.
We all survived. So I think those are all important things to remember. I hope that you guys got value out of this. I do have to say that I am not an economist. And I'm just a realtor. And so if I said anything wrong that wasn't 100% accurate, I'm sorry. I did my best. And I'm trying to learn all this stuff and kind of get it out to you guys too and put it in terms that you understand. So I hope that you got something out of it. And I hope that it kind of brought some clarity to all of the things that are being reported out there. And most of the stuff that's being reported out there, we just probably shouldn't really pay attention to and just focus on you and focus on what you're doing and just keep doing it. And yeah.
That's all you can do.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add?
I've got nothing to add. You've said it all, Danny.
I've said it all. So cool. Well, I appreciate you guys for tuning in. I would love to get your feedback. If you want more stuff like this, definitely let me know. If you'd prefer us to kind of keep to the old way where we just talk strictly housing, happy to do that as well. We do this for you. So please respond. Send us your questions. Garrett and I do a weekly Instagram live where we answer real estate related questions, pop culture questions. It's kind of fun. So please send us those. We've also got an Amazon Alexa skill that I've been pushing pretty hard where we do daily updates and they're theme days. So it's not super boring stuff all the time. So tune into that. And again, thank you guys so much for tuning in and we appreciate you. And a recession's not the worst thing in the world.
We'll see you next month.
All right.